What's good, y'all? This is your boy Blak G 92. Now, for this evening, I plan on doing probably like 2 or 3 reaction videos. I got one that's been requested from someone I haven't got a request from in a long time, so I'm gonna do that after I do this one, and then I'm gonna do another one after that, like probably sometime space them out 2 hours apart from each other. But anyway, I'm going. Like I said, the video I'm reacting to is from the Critical Drinker, and this one is titled "Production Hell, the entire DCEU." The title look interesting, and I've been wanting to go see what the drinker been up to as of recent. I seen he's been cranking out videos as usual. So, and plus, not to mention, I noticed the ones I did react to from his channel got a lot of traffic. So let's see how this breakdown sound looks like in about 3, 2, 1.
You know, normally my production hell videos tend to focus on one particular project that was notoriously difficult to get made, either because of creative differences behind the scenes, issues with the cast and crew, difficult shooting conditions, or just all-round generalized insanity. The history of filmmaking is littered with stories like that, and not only do they teach us valuable lessons about how not to make movies, but they're also pretty damn funny to point and laugh at. But there are some screw-ups so monumental, so unfathomably huge that they can't be confined to a single movie or TV show.
Right,
instead,
it's just
spill out to encompass an entire franchise spanning more than a dozen projects over a span of almost a decade. I'm talking, of course, about DC on Film, better known as the DCEU, the grand plan that was going to rival Marvel.
Now, before we say anything else, DCEU is quite the mess indeed, as you see from the clips. So many different styles of like film and such like that, and of course the TV series. Very different. I haven't seen all of them. Like, there's some I haven't seen yet, of course, but based on what I've seen this far, it's definitely a mess. Not really connected to one another. There's maybe some connection to the mainline storyline. There's some ones that made under like DC films that's in their own little universe, so it's like hard to keep up with from now on site looking in.
Turned out to be one of the biggest creative and commercial disasters, not to mention wastes of talent in all of Hollywood history. It was an epic tale of greed, envy, creative mismanagement, alliances, backstabbings, and hubris. So settle in with a glass of something smooth and intoxicating. The drinker's about to tell you the story.
I wish I had a drink on me right now.
Now, the idea for a shared cinematic DC universe wasn't exactly a new one. In fact, way back in the late 1990s when Warner were still trying to get a Nick Cage Superman movie off the ground. And check out my video on that disaster if you want to know how it's possible to blow $30 million without shooting a single frame. There was already talk of a possible crossover with the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, possibly even leading into a Justice League team-up. One can only imagine the delights of Nick Cage teaming up with the campiest Batman since Adam West. Anyway, nothing came
that
of
would
this
have been
grand
goofy as hell.
And Warner quickly abandoned it to focus on solo Superman and Batman movies. But
Thanks for the best.
Nothing rejuvenates old ideas quicker than someone else making money out of them, and the meteoric rise of the MCU in the early 2010s was enough to get Warner executives thinking once again. Hey, this whole shared universe thing seems to be working out pretty well for Marvel. We should have one of our own. Great idea, friend. But we need to get it up and running fast because Marvel are way ahead and we've got a lot of catching up to do. Agreed. Bring me someone who can make that happen. As it turned out, the man they picked for the job was Zack Snyder. Now, I think in retrospect, most of us would probably agree that Snyder, well, how can I put this diplomatically, might not have been the optimal choice for a role like this. But 10 years ago, it was a pretty different story, and in a lot of ways, he actually had a lot to recommend him as a director. He'd had a string of well-received movies. He excelled at producing dark, gritty, violent films that would stand in sharp contrast to the bright colours and chirpy humour of the MCU, and in theory, all of this would allow DC to position itself as the cool, mature, and edgy alternative to Marvel. Now, you might think that Snyder would have been a logical fit to direct a dark, gritty, violent Batman movie, which would have been right up his alley. So, of course, Warner did the exact opposite and put him in charge of a Superman film. Man of Steel turned out to be the movie that would launch the new DC universe on film, and while Henry Cavill's casting was generally well received, Snyder's brooding, conflicted take on the character wasn't, and Man of Steel earned a lukewarm reception at the box office. But don't worry, worse was yet to come. A lot worse. See?
I already know when he says it like that, it's gonna go right into why the film doesn't work. But yeah, like I actually own a copy of Man of Steel, and you know it's okay at best. You know, what I mean, it wasn't the best adaptation of Superman, but for what we had, for what it was, you know, it's serviceable. You know, it just wasn't the Superman. But you know, you can't have everything that you want. So, but Henry Cavill was a great choice for the Clark Kent side Superman, though. He was a great choice. Looks the part, everything.
Snyder's plan was to do a sequel to Man of Steel first, and then introduce Batman based on The Dark Knight Returns, followed by a team-up with the other members of the Justice League in an epic two-part storyline that would culminate in the death of Superman's story from the comics. Fair enough, but Warner executives weren't happy with this plan. Marvel had already had their first big Avengers team-up film that went on to make $1.5 billion, and naturally they wanted a piece of the action. There wasn't time to introduce each character in their own movies and patiently build up the franchise like they should have done. They wanted results, and fast. So Man of Steel 2 morphed into Batman vs Superman, a film that would introduce not one but two of the biggest storylines in DC history, as well as being a backdoor intro for Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Cyborg and The Flash. And if this all sounds like a lot of work to put on the second movie in a franchise, well, that's because it was. You don't need me to tell you that Batman vs Superman was a shit show. It was too long, too bloated and convoluted.
That's what I've heard.
The conflict between the two leads didn't make much sense. The tone was bleak and depressing, and the introduction of Wonder Woman felt tacked on and distracting. The failure of Batman vs Superman sent shockwaves through Warner Brothers, who were convinced that they had a mega hit on their hands. It was clear to the studio heads that Snyder's bleak, somber, grimdark take on the franchise wasn't working out, and they needed to change course drastically. Their movies needed to be lighter, funnier, and shorter. Basically, they needed to be just like the MCU, the very thing that they were supposed to be against.
Yeah.
And the casualties began to mount straight away.
Ooh.
Suicide Squad, which was pretty much in the can by this point, was subjected to extensive reshoots and re-edits in a desperate attempt to shorten the length, inject more humour and ramp up the pace. The resulting Frankenstein's monster of a film was practically disowned by director David Ayer, who was rightly pissed off at having his creative vision flushed down the pan, and heavily criticised by fans who to this day are campaigning for the original cut to be released. The only point of hope for DC on film was the surprise success of...
Yeah, it would be nice if we get the original cut of Suicide Squad released some day or another. Now, the finish for the original theatrical version, decent enough. You could definitely tell there's a lot missing, especially with Jared Leto's depiction of the Joker, what may have you. And there's other parts you could tell is edited down to fit a runtime and such. And there's been enough like scenes or minutes like building up on the individual characters and such like that, except for maybe a couple of them, like namely Harley Quinn and Deadshot. Everyone else, not so much. They were kind of just stand-ins and shit. So a little bit nice if they spend more time just like developing the characters instead of like having it condensed down to the runtime that the original theatrical version was. I'm sure that the original like cut that David Ayer's done that has not seen live day probably expand upon it slightly a bit more, but I don't know. Probably ain't much add on to it anyway. So probably would never happen, but we'll see.
Wonder Woman, which had been largely insulated from the fallout of Batman vs Superman and enjoyed a relatively trouble-free production. And its success cemented the idea that the only way forward was to ditch the bleak nihilism of the Snyder movies and focus more on optimism, warmth, heart, and positive heroic characters. Unfortunately, one good movie wasn't enough to keep the franchise going, and an even bigger disaster was on the horizon. Justice League was intended to be the biggest movie of the franchise so far, bringing in all the major players for an epic battle that would eclipse even the Avengers. The only problem is that Warner were now in full-on panic mode after the failure of Batman vs Superman, desperately trying to course-correct, and their attempts to get Snyder to produce a shorter, funnier, and lighter cut of the film were a bit like asking Sarah Silverman to make something that isn't shit. And when personal tragedy forced Snyder to drop out of post-production, Warner seized the opportunity to bring in a man who could give them their own personal version of the Avengers. Imaginatively enough, the man who made the fucking Avengers in the first place. It was a desperation move by a studio lurching from one disaster to another, groping for a solution to a problem that they didn't fully understand. And even if they did, Whedon was given neither the time nor the resources to properly fix the movie. An overweight and alcoholic Ben Affleck was brought back in for hastily organised reshoots, and no amount of makeup and wardrobe could hide the fact that he was out of shape and disinterested in the part. Henry Cavill, who was in the middle of filming Mission Impossible, was refused permission to shave off off his moustache, resulting in possibly the most hilariously terrible CGI job in history. Ultimately, the best that Whedon could manage was a bodge job that satisfied nobody, ballooned the budget to over $300 million, and resulted in a Frankenstein's monster of a film that was very clearly two different movies made by two different directors, awkwardly forced together. Justice League was an absolute failure commercially and got savaged by fans and critics alike. By this point, the DCEU was pretty much in freefall. Plans to make a solo Batman movie with Ben Affleck fell apart, and Ben used the opportunity to quietly exit the franchise. There were also growing rumours that Henry Cavill was out as Superman, with no plans to develop further movies with him. And it wasn't just actors that were dropping out either. John Berg and Jeff Johns, the two executives put in charge of the franchise after Snyder's exit, were also shuffled out the door after the Justice League farce. Replacing them was Walter Hamada, who had a new plan for DC on film, to rebuild the franchise around a more diverse cast of central superheroes.
Shit.
Batman and Superman would be written out and replaced.
Whenever you hear those words, diverse cast, whatever may have you, it's always some asterisk or quotation mark. You know what I mean? Oftentimes it's focused on what the characters look like instead of having them written well. So that's always a worrying sign.
Counterparts Batgirl and Supergirl, and they would join Wonder Woman as the three central pillars of the new and inclusive DCEU, with Harley Quinn also getting her own series of films. Lovely stuff. The only problem is that all these things would take years to implement, and in the meantime, they still had hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in movies currently in development, and they couldn't afford to just shit-can them. That sort of thing would come later. So instead, the DCEU would go through a period of transition, focusing more on solo movies with no particular overarching storyline to tie them together, while they prepared to launch their new and inclusive version of the franchise. And what's interesting is that some of these movies ended up doing pretty well. Aquaman somehow managed to gross over $1 billion, becoming the highest grossing movie of the entire DCEU.
They made a lot of money.
Me, I'll never understand how or why people went to see it. And although Shazam was a more modest success financially...
Now, before we say anything about Shazam, I can easily answer that question because of Jason Momoa and him being shirtless. That's the main reason it got so much money in the box office of Aquaman. Because, like, I'm quite sure that's the main reason because of who's in the movie. Jason Momoa with his chiseled physique and all that shit. That's the only reason that Aquaman made that much money. Of course, there's genuine Aquaman fans out there, but let's be real. It's the actor that's in the movie that starred as a titular character. That's what brought so much money.
Small budget and positive reception were enough to greenlight a sequel. The end result of all these shenanigans was a weirdly confusing picture where films with low expectations turned out to be big hits, while the crowd-pleasing tentpole movies they needed to anchor their franchise kept failing miserably. Complicating things even further were standalone movies like Joker, which turned into mega successes against small budgets, finally earning them the critical and commercial success they desperately wanted, but impossible to incorporate into the larger DCEU. 2020 would end up being a turning point for Walter Hamada's new vision. Birds of Prey, the movie intended to launch Harley Quinn as a major player in the franchise, turned out to be a massive critical and commercial flop. And looking back, I think it's pretty obvious that the studio badly overestimated two important things: the popularity of Harley Quinn as a character, and the star power of Margot Robbie. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was followed up by Wonder Woman 1984. See, the success of the first movie had freed up director Patty Jenkins to have more creative control over the sequel, including writing the script, which again, in hindsight, proved that the studio badly overestimated two things: her ability to write compelling stories and her ability to direct competent action scenes. Either way, Wonder Woman 1984 got scathing reviews, largely killing off the goodwill towards the character, and the unspecified virus of origin effectively killed its chances at the box office. And if all that wasn't bad enough, a ghost from DC's past was about to come back to haunt them.
Zack Snyder.
Ever since the Justice League debacle, there had been a growing online movement for the studio to release the original Zack Snyder version of the movie. Naturally, this was not a thing Warner were keen to do, because if it happened to be a big success, it would only underline the magnitude of their own fuck-up with how the film was managed. But that all changed conveniently enough when AT&T bought them over, and because they needed something to put on their new HBO Max streaming service, the Snyder Cut was brought back from the dead like a fucking zombie and released in March 2021. Now, from a filmmaking point of view, I have to admit that it's kind of fascinating to compare the two wildly different versions, but from a commercial perspective, it was an absolute disaster for DC. Releasing what amounted to a competing project that even teased the possibility of further film development only served to fragment an already divided fan base, undermining Warner's own plans for the future and making them look like a studio at war with themselves. But hey, there was at least one tiny cause for optimism on the horizon. James Gunn, who was taking a hiatus from Marvel after some uncomfortable old tweets resurfaced, was lured over to DC to make a sequel to the Suicide Squads. I mean, I say sequel, but it was more like a soft reboot,
it's a
most
reboot
of the main characters and basically starting again. Either way, it was a big hit with fans, and even if it didn't make too much money because of the pandemic, it showed what Gunn could do with DC properties. And keep that one in mind because it's going to be important later.
I can't wait to hear.
It was becoming pretty obvious that things needed to change, and fast. The DCEU had been meandering without much sense of direction ever since Justice League. Walter Hamada's vision for a female-led franchise wasn't looking so appealing after Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman 1984, and most important of all, the studio was running out of money. The merger between Warner and Discovery finally brought this change in the shape of David Zaslav, the new CEO of Warner Discovery.
I've heard of that guy.
Zaslav had a reputation as a hard-nosed businessman who took no shit and was willing to do whatever it took to get things back on track. And after reviewing Hamada's plans for DC on film, he promptly decided, fuck this, and took a scythe to the whole thing. Aquaman 2, Black Adam, and The Flash were too far along in development to be cancelled, but as for the rest of their film and TV projects, it was an absolute bloodbath. Supergirl was axed, and so was an almost finished Batgirl, not to mention Legends of Tomorrow, Stargirl, Batwoman, and Batman Beyond. He also began a search for someone to oversee all future DC projects moving forward, realising at last that what they really needed was their own version of Marvel's Kevin Feige. And as it happens, his attention soon came to rest on James Gunn. Remember him? He'd impressed the studio with his work on the Suicide Squad, and since he was coming to the end of his tenure at Marvel, they were able to bring him in to oversee future projects. As for Black Adam, any hope whatsoever of salvaging the DCEU in its current form pretty much rested on its shoulders. The plan was for it to act as a kind of soft reboot, acknowledging past events but mostly being used to usher in a new phase of DC movies. The Rock had kind of a reputation.
Well, it happened again. Forgot to clear up space on my, not hard drive, but more so, I forgot to clear up space on the hard drive, so now I had to clear that up, get that sorted out, so then I can have enough space to finish up this reaction video. So I'm going to go ahead and finish where I left off. I rewind it a little bit, so then I can just go back right into it, get the vibe back on. So
attention soon came to rest on James Gunn. Remember him? Well, he'd impressed the studio with his work on the Suicide Squad, and since he was coming to the end of his tenure at Marvel, they were able to bring him in to oversee future projects. As for Black Adam, any hope whatsoever of salvaging the DCEU in its current form pretty much rested on its shoulders.
Basically.
The plan was for it to act as a kind of soft reboot, acknowledging past events but mostly being used to usher in a new phase of DC movies. The Rock had kind of a reputation by this point as a franchise saver, and he worked hard to get Henry Cavill involved to set up future Superman movies. Finally, it seemed like DC were getting their act together. Unfortunately, Black Adam failed to take off at the box office, and with it went any real hope of salvaging DC on film, and not long after, the cancellations began. Henry Cavill was out as Superman just weeks after announcing his return to the role. Gal Gadot was out as Wonder Woman. Black Adam 2 was cancelled. Basically, James Gunn was cleaning house, doing a hard reboot of DC on film. The only movies to escape this cancellation were the ones almost ready for release, although you have to wonder who's going to bother watching films that have no possible way forward once they come out. The release of Aquaman 2 at the end of this year is going to effectively represent the final installment of the DCEU as it was intended. And with that ends what may be the most poorly managed, badly implemented...
Because, whatchamacallit, what's her name? The actress that was on the first one, like, of course we all know what happened with her, you know, all that controversy going on her personal life as such. And we all know the case and everything, so I ain't gonna repeat it. But anyway, and of course, it took them years to finally get that film. I had no idea it was still a thing, like Aquaman 2. But I'm sure if they get all the parts together, that's going to be left in the film, or may have you. It's going to turn out good, I guess. I haven't seen the first one, so I wouldn't know where to compare it to.
Wastes of talent and potential in the whole history of Hollywood. A franchise that pretty much stands as a textbook example of what not to do when you're trying to launch an extended universe. And I think if I had to pin down the reasons for its failure, I'd probably list 3 main flaws. 1. Hiring the wrong creatives. What this franchise needed was someone with a strong creative vision that would cover the next several years at least, who also understood and respected the characters they'd be working with. And in retrospect, Zack Snyder wasn't that guy.
Nah.
His style was too dark, too bleak, too nihilistic, and too divisive for a franchise like this. Number 2, playing catch-up. Instead of launching with a well-developed plan of their own, Warner waited until Marvel had scored a massive hit with the Avengers, and from then on, it was a frantic race to catch up to them. Their eagerness to release their own big event movie led to them rushing and condensing storylines together, tripping over their own feet, and producing substandard products that push people away instead of drawing them in. Number 3, constant course correction. A string of early failures threw the studio into panic and chaos and led to a revolving door of senior executives, each with different visions for what the franchise should be, none of whom really had the time to properly implement their ideas. This led to a series of wild swings in different directions creatively, forcing hasty reshoots and re-edits as movie directors struggled to keep up with conflicting ideas. Unlike Marvel, who charted a consistent creative direction and stuck to it, DC stumbled from flop to unexpected hit with no idea of what they needed to do. And the sad thing about all this is that they had most of the elements they needed to succeed. They had some of the best superhero characters in history, they had a strong cast of mostly good actors who were perfect for the roles, and they had legions of devoted fans just waiting to see their favourite comic book moments brought to life. But ultimately, they failed to capitalise on any of these things, and the end result was a decade of time and hundreds of millions of dollars wasted. Maybe James Gunn is going to be the franchise saviour that everyone hopes he'll be, or maybe he'll be just another entry in a long line of short-lived creatives who came and went before they really got a chance to make their ideas reality. Either way, none of that changes the fact that the DCEU truly was production hell.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away.
From
now.
hindsight and just reflecting on it, and of course seeing this video as well, just put things in perspective of how much of a mess DCEU was. They really had some good actors and actresses in there, plus not to mention some like amazing superheroes, but they just did not know how to have any consistent hits, whether commercially or critically. You know what I mean? They couldn't. They just like were never consistent. It was always it seemed like it was a revolving door of like writers and directors and such. And of course, they could have easily picked someone else aside from Zack Snyder if you really think about it. Someone that like not only understood the source material, understood and respected the source material, also competent director and such. That wasn't lean too hard on the nihilism and shit like that. But yeah, I did like this video though. It was very enjoyable. As you know, the amount of times I laughed at it at the points I was discussing. Joan that was joked about as such. Yeah, it was very entertaining as Drinker is. You know what I mean? I might do another reaction to another production. I might look up the one he did on the Nicolas Cage Superman movie. I had no idea that was a thing. I'm about to do some research on that and see how that ended up not seeing the light of day. Because he mentioned they spent like $30 million. It's like, how did they spend $30 million without shooting a single scene? I don't know how that happened. Let me see what people saying in the comment section. The expression "slow and steady wins the race" is a cautionary tale for a reason. That DCEU is a perfect example of what happens when you try to rush things to catch up to your rivals. Exactly. Exactly. That's what it is. They kept on trying to compete with Marvel and just fell flat on his face. Instead of just taking the slow and steady route and building up the characters over different movies, and then have the big team ups and all that shit, and then bring the more obscure team of villains or heroes into it, and then they could get the success. But nope, they just want to just play catch up and just try to ride off the back of Marvel, you know what I mean, which is not a good idea to begin with. But anyway, if you want me to react to more of these type of breakdowns based on really into movies or music or may have you, post them in the comment section below. I might do more of these within the next few days. I may have you. And also, if this is your first time watching this reaction video, be sure to hit that like button, hit that notification button, hit that subscribe button as well. And be sure to follow me on my social media accounts. We post in the description box below. And if you're able to, hit up that donation link to my Cash App to help support the channel. The road to 50K subscribers, but the first 6 months is going to be 25,000 subscribers. So we'll work towards that goal of 25,000 subscribers. So stay tuned. Let your friends know about the channels. We have a lot more coming in. This your boy Blak G92 about to sign off. Holla at your boy. Peace.